Hi, welcome to Implementing Plaid in Bubble.io. This is Unit 2 on transactions. I'm Brian Alderman, the founder and principal of Lost Sheep Advisors, a boutique no-code consulting firm specializing in financial and business operations solutions. You can visit us more at lostsheep.dev. I built the Plaid plugin that you're using within Bubble. I'm also the creator behind ivcode.app and the developer behind a number of other Bubble apps. Lost Sheep Advisory is different from most no-code agencies. First off, you work directly with me and benefit from my 10 years in building software products, with a particular emphasis on all things fintech. Second, we know you want to solve a problem and build a business. We're business builders too. When you work with us, building the app is secondary to building the business. The app is just a vehicle to achieving your goals. We created this set of videos to get you started integrating Plaid into your Bubble app. These videos and support via email are included when you buy the plugin. Send us an email at info@lostsheep.dev. If you want more support, check out lostsheep.dev and please get in touch. We offer on-demand office hours, development projects to execute your vision, and fractional CTO models to help you with strategy and expert ownership of your technology. Thanks for watching. Let's get started. In this video, we're going to cover the Plaid Transactions product. By the end of this video, your app will be set up for transaction use cases like personal finance apps and transaction analysis. Specifically, you'll be able to save historical transactions to your Bubble database when your user connects an account. Historical transactions here just means things before the time when the user connected their account to your app. You'll be able to maintain an updated list of those transactions over time. You'll create a transaction list for your user without saving the transaction data, so you can show data without saving it into your Bubble database. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances of transactional data, like pending transactions, transaction categories, and handling pagination. The Plaid transaction product is especially broad. It can do a number of different things, and your use case will vary highly the way that you'll interact with this product. I'm going to show you some of the basic principles and how to get up and running, but you'll more than likely need to adapt what I show you today to match your specific use case. As with everything in Bubble, and in particular everything with Plaid, there are multiple ways to do something. I'm going to show you one of them that I happen to have had a lot of success with, but your mileage may vary. In the first part of this video, we're going to talk about storing data, and the second part, querying data without storing it. How do we know which one to do and which one might be right for your use case? There's a couple of considerations that you may want to think about. If you are doing a lot of analysis of your transactions or the trends in those transactions, or if you're letting your user manipulate and save transaction data in your application, you may want to save the data in your Bubble database. Otherwise, you can rely on Plaid to maintain the data and just query their API whenever you need the data. That means you wouldn't duplicate the data or save it into your Bubble database, and you would have lower initial processing times, faster display to the user, less Bubble capacity used. You might want to do that if you're only looking at and displaying the transactions, not analyzing or manipulating the data in a significant way. I'm going to show you both of them in this video. We'll start with how to save the data to your database, and then we'll look at a way to just show it to your user using, say, a graph or a table of transactions. Again, your mileage may vary depending on your particular use case. One other important thing to note is the data model. In a previous video on Plaid Link, we set up the institution and account level in your Bubble app. Transactions extend that. Each transaction belongs to an account. As I've shown here, you'll have a bunch of transactions for an account. And in the case when we're saving data, we're going to set up our Bubble database in this way. We'll come back and look at this slide when we get there. So with that, let's dive in. We're going to get started processing historical transactions. All right, so I've gone over here into Bubble, and as I showed you in the Plaid Link video, one of the first things we need to do is make sure we are, at the time of Plaid Link, initializing the transactions product. So that's what's done here in Plaid products in that create a link token step. So I'm starting out with transactions here. for the sake of this demo. Know that if you have existing links to Plaid, Transactions is one of the products you can actually initiate after the fact just by calling any of the transaction endpoints or doing any of the transaction actions that will get added to your users after the fact in most cases. But the easiest way is just to specify the products up front that you're going to use. In this case, transactions, that's specified in the Plaid products of create link token, and we're good to go there. The other thing we need to change from what we did with Plaid Link is actually over on the webhooks. So I'm going to go to the backend workflows and this Plaid webhook. We talked about this a little bit in that Plaid Link video. This is how Plaid tells us that new data is available for us to go get. And if you remember, we set up through the detect data a bunch of different fields. We didn't really do anything with it other than save that data to a new Plaid webhooks table. So that was what was going on here. And if I go and look at my data under app data and Plaid webhooks, here's a couple examples of what those webhooks look like. Transactions, default updates, etc. We actually need to make a change in the backend workflows to this Plaid webhook. We didn't include a type in the first video because it was more transaction specific. So we're going to go ahead and include that now. So I just go find this Plaid webhook endpoint and go into modify types. And you'll see in my original detect data transaction that we used, there was a field here called new transactions. It had a number in it. This number is what Plaid is saying with this webhook, there are this many new transactions to come get. So that's already coming in as a number. That was good to go. We just need to make sure we're saving that in the create a Plaid webhook step. So I'm going to create a new field, new transaction count as part of this Plaid webhook item. It's going to be a number, and I'm going to put that new transactions field from the API into my database in the Plaid webhooks with that new transaction count. Let's go ahead and see this in action, and then we will learn more about what we're seeing and what we then do with it. So what I have gotten set up here is, and if you go to lostcheap.dev/plaid-transactions, you'll see exactly this. What I've set up is the same thing we set up in the Plaid link scenario, where we have a new button that starts a new Plaid link session. And then I've got some other stuff we'll see some results in here in a moment. So let's go ahead and get that rolling. Just refresh my preview here. So I have that new Plaid link. Let's connect an account and we'll see what's going on with the data we just changed with our webhooks. So I'm going to pick a bank. This is still the sandbox, so it's all test data. Which bank you select doesn't matter. So I've successfully created an account. Let's go take a look at our backend app data, and you'll see actually it shows up right here because of the way I've set it up. So what's showing right here is the different webhooks that have been saved for this bank we just linked. And you'll see there's 3 here. You might see 2, you might see 3. What they are is an initial update and a historical update. Let's go look at this from the app data side as well. So in my app data side, here are the 3 we were just looking at, these top 3 rows. So 2 historical update and an initial update. So what is this? When your user connects their bank to Plaid and you've initiated that transactions product, Plaid goes out to the bank and says, start giving me data on the historical transactions up to 2 years in the past. That's the limit of Plaid's data. The first thing it'll do is try to get the first 30 days of data. Once Plaid has that first 30 days of data, it'll fire this initial update webhook and tell you how many transactions it has ready for you to come out and get. So that's the initial 30 days. Usually this takes 10 seconds or so. In Sandbox, it's all a lot faster than it is in production. But generally, 10 seconds or so to get an initial update. That's that first 30 days of data. Then it goes and gets the historical data all the way back to those 2 years. And when Plaid has all that data collected from the bank, which can take up to about 2 minutes sometimes, it'll fire this historical update webhook and tell your app, hey, I have this many transactions ready. In this case, you'll notice 374 plus 16 is 390, so it's actually firing twice. That's because we have not yet gone out to get the data. This new transactions is how many new transactions since you last went and said, hey, Plaid, give me the transactions. So what do I mean by historical data? All the data, all the transactions included here are before the moment your user connected their account to your app. We'll deal with the data from that moment forward in a little while, but for now we're just dealing with that historical data. So what do we need to do from here? When our app is told, oh, we have data ready for you, either an initial update or a historical update, we actually need to say, okay, Plaid, give me the data. That's what we're going to go through and set up now. The way we're going to do that is using one method that I like to do it in that I found some success in is using a database trigger that says whenever I have a new webhook that's of the type historical update, then go get the number of transactions that Plaid has told me to go get. So we're going to set that up. That's, of course, not the only way you could do this. It's just a way that I have seen this work. So let's go do that. The first thing we're going to need to do, let's think back a little bit to what we're doing in our backend workflows. We're going to say, hey, Plaid, give me all these transactions, then I want to save those transactions to my database. So let's work backwards. Let's start by setting up the step to save the transaction to my database, and then we'll figure out how to actually trigger that to tell Bubble, hey, go get these transactions. So what I'm going to do is very similar to how we set up create account. I'm going to create a new API workflow, create transaction. It's not public, and this is going to take in a whole bunch of parameters about transactions. The information I'm looking at here, just to remind us, we looked at this earlier, it's all the different data that's available on transactions. This is not everything that Plaid offers. This is just some of the more common ones. You can check out the full Plaid documentation for all the different fields that are available. That's linked on this page at lostsheep.dev, but I'm just going to use some of these most common ones. So I'm going to say this takes in a account ID. So what account is this associated to? I'll just leave that as text for now. We'll handle that in a different way here in a moment. I'm going to say transaction ID, amount, category, that's actually a list, category ID, that's text, currency, date, authorized date. So this is all just coming from that entity relationship diagram, and it happens to be the data that I know my app is going to need. Again, your mileage may vary. It's pretty easy to come in here and keep adding these later if you need to. So I'd suggest these to get started. And payment channel. So I've gone through and put all of those fields in here. Those are the fields that this API is going to take in. Then I need to actually do what we want to do, which is save this to my database. So I'm going to create a new thing, and that new thing is going to be of a new type. It's going to be a Plaid transaction. And that Plaid transaction is going to take all the data of these transactions and save it to my database in Bubble. The first field, I'm just going to go in the same order. The first field is the account. And this one, if you remember from when we set up that API a second ago, we said account ID was just a text. Now at this step, when we actually save it to our database, we want to change it to the actual Plaid account that we've already saved, that we set up in that Plaid link video, to create that full relationship in Bubble between transactions and accounts. So how do I do that? I say the account is, it's not the account ID, because that's a text, it's not an account. I actually need to here do a search for Plaid accounts, where account ID equals account ID. And say that first item. There's a trap in here that you've got to be careful with when doing this approach. Because of the way Bubble handles APIs, and the speed at which different things happen when you integrate with Plaid, this account that it's searching for might not exist yet. So in that case, it would find nothing here when it goes to create this transaction in the database, and you just have an empty field. To avoid that, we can say, put an only when here, and say only when the same search we just set up only when this count is not 0. So as long as it finds this account to fill out in this field, it'll do this step. Otherwise, it'll skip it. If it skips it, we can just have it try again in a little while and see, is this account created? Because in parallel to this, Bubble's going to be creating these accounts. Just needs some time. It's called a race condition. Just needs some time to make sure that the accounts exist first. An easy way to handle that, I can schedule the API workflow again, the same exact one, create transaction, and this time I'm just going to tell it, schedule it, let's say 30 seconds from now, to give Bubble enough time to create the accounts, and I'll just pass through all the same data. So it's, I'm just telling it, run this again, this whole workflow again, if you don't find the account the first time around. This is a fairly nuanced way to do things. There's other ways to handle this. Your mileage, again, may vary. I like this way. It's clean to me. It matches the way that I think. I'll show you a different way to think about transactions a little later in the video. But I like this way. So what this is doing is only when, so I need to have it do the opposite of the previous steps. So only when Plaid account ID equals account ID, count is 0. So when it doesn't find the account, it'll schedule this again in 30 seconds to try again. And then on the other one, if it's not 0, so if it does find the account, it'll go ahead and save it to the database and won't try again in 30 seconds. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's keep going on down through the create a new Plaid transaction to work through more fields. The next one here is the transaction ID. This is just text. Remember transaction ID. One thing I do want to check here though too is I want to make sure I'm not saving the same transaction to my Bubble database more than once, because that can happen in a number of different scenarios. It's something you want to be a little careful about. So I'm going to add another only when condition here. And I'm going to tell it to do a search for Plaid transactions where the ID equals transaction ID. Only when that count is 0. So what that said is if you find this transaction already exists, so if the count is not 0, so if it is already found, then don't do this step, or said a different way, only do this step when you can't find the transaction you're trying to create already in my Bubble database. So go through and do that. Those are the two complicated fields here. The rest of these are fairly straightforward. So I can walk through them pretty quickly here and just save all the different data to the database. I'm just going through and creating all the fields in my category in my database. Remember, category is a list. And we'll talk more about categories towards the end of this video as well. Category ID, date, authorized date. Name, which is the same as description. That's just the Plaid terminology for it. Merchant. And the last field here that I'm going to create is payment channel. And then I want to go through and say the data passed to the API is the data that I want you to save. All right. So just to review what we've done, we've set up an API workflow that you pass a bunch of data to. It creates the transaction if the transaction doesn't already exist, and if it's able to find the account to associate the transaction to. If it's not able to find the account, it schedules itself again 30 seconds from now to try again. This workflow right now we've not scheduled, this API workflow. So the next thing we need to do is connect the dots between the fact that that webhook existed, the historical data, I've got 390 new transactions for you, the fact that that exists to actually say, okay, now go out and get the transactions and start saving them to my database. So we've created the shell for it. Now we need to actually say, hey, go use this shell. The way I'm going to do that is a database trigger. So this database trigger is going to be historical dates. It's going to use that webhook. So what this is doing, if I go back to my Plaid webhooks, what we want this to do is every time a new historical update webhook comes in, I want this to go out and get the new transactions. So I'm going to set up a database trigger that says whenever a new webhook of type transactions and code historical updates happens, go get the transactions I'm looking for. So historical updates, it's a Plaid webhook type. Only one, the Plaid webhook's type is transactions, and code is historical update. What do I want it to do when there's a new webhook of type transactions and code historical update? I want to run my create transaction API on a list of all the transactions that are available. So I'm going to schedule an API workflow on a list. The API workflow I want to run is create transaction. There's all those fields we set up a minute ago. Then we just need to tell it, here's the list to run on. That's the type of things that I want to run on. And in this list, you'll see there's a transactions, get transaction, body transaction. Not transactions, body account, or get transaction. These are the different, in API terminology, the different objects that are inside the thing that Plaid is telling us. The one we want is the list of transactions. We're interested in transaction. So I want get transactions, body transaction. And then the actual list to run on. This is the step that's super important because this is where we say, now go out to Plaid and get the transactions that Plaid just told me are ready. So I'm going to get data from an external API, that's Plaid, and go pick that Plaid transactions, get transactions API. So there's a couple fields we have to fill out here. The first one is the access token. Remember the access token from the Plaid link video. The access token is our keys. It's what we need to tell Plaid, hey, we have permission to get this data. So how would we go get that and associate it here? Well, if you'll notice back in the webhooks, there was an item ID along with the webhooks. If you remember, that item ID, I go back to the institutions, that item ID we saved on our institutions table along with the access token that we need to get data for this institution. So what I have to do in my step here, if I go back into the step here, is I have to go find that access token. I do that by saying, do a search for Plaid institutions where that access token exists, where item ID equals Plaid webhook now's item ID, because we saw that the webhook includes the item ID. We want it to match the item ID in our Plaid institutions table. Take the first item, because there should only be one, item's access token. So that should be the correct access token to use here. The next two fields are a date filter, and these are required filters to tell Plaid, here's the date range I want to get transactions. You have up to a 2-year history of transactions, but you may not want all of those for your particular use case. So you need to fill out the start date here and the end date here as appropriate. In my example, I'm going to say, for my use case, I only need 90 days of transaction history. I don't necessarily need the full 2 years. And that number Plaid returned is the full 2 years. So I want here to say, what was 90 days ago? That's the start date of the transactions I want back. So I can do current date and time plus days minus 90. And then I have to make sure to format this in the correct format. It says here YYYY So format it as custom YYYY Oops. Sorry, that needs to be lowercase. YYYY You'll see that it shows here, that's the current date, formatted as 2021-08-25. That's the format Plaid expects. For the end date, in my use case, I want the last 90 days up until today. So I can say the current date and time, formatted the same way. YYYY 2021-08-25. The last two fields down here, we'll talk a little more about at the end of the video, but basically what it's saying is how many transactions do you want back? The default is 100. If you leave count blank, it's just going to give you the first 100 transactions that match your date criteria. In my case here, I know how many transactions I'm after, or at least the maximum number. It's how many that Plaid webhook's new transaction count was, that 390. So now what I've said is give me up to 390 that also match my start and date criteria. Offset we'll talk about at the end. This is what happens when you're looking for more than 500 transactions. I'm going to leave that blank for now. So now that I've set up the external data here, one last thing I need to do is Plaid transactions, get transactions. I'm specifically looking for the body transactions. So remember up here we picked get transactions, body transactions. That's got to match the list here. Get transactions, body transactions. It's going to run on the create transactions workflow. I want it to do that right now. And then I need to go through and fill out the data. We set up this data in the create transactions API earlier. Now we're saying here's the data actually to go run through this API and start creating in my database. So I say this transactions, get transactions, body transactions, account ID. So this is one transaction at a time, go through and find and send this correct data to my application. So I'm just going to go through here, say this transactions, which field is this? Category. This transactions category ID, so all the way down through the fields that I'm interested in. You'll notice here in the this transactions, get transactions, body transaction, there's a bunch more fields than the ones we're interested in. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of other fields available in Plaid. The ones I'm using here are the most common. You can check out Plaid's documentation for descriptions of all these different fields. Some of them are only used in certain use cases, so I'm not going to go through them here, but your use case may need different fields. Merchant name, and this transaction, get transactions, payment channel. All right, so that's all set up. It's going to run that workflow on a list, go through the create transaction, save them to my database. Let's go ahead and see that in action. So I'm going to go do the same, create and link a new account so that I trigger a brand new historical update. Webhook. Still in the sandbox, so I can pick any of these banks in here. Once that happens, we'll start seeing a bunch of things happen. So the first thing, we'll see the webhooks come in. So there's my webhook for 374. And if I go watch my backend database, you'll see, hey, there's the webhooks we were interested in, or the webhook we were interested in for the new transactions. I can see the new accounts were created in here, and I should start be able to see transactions get created. There they are, being created in my database. Looks like the authorized dates are blank for all of these. That might just be the test data, doesn't have authorized date in it. And I can start to see amounts filled out, categories, category IDs, currencies. If I drill in deeper, it's associating things correctly to the accounts. Let's see, what else is it filling out here? Merchants and transaction names. Payment channel, is it in-store, is it online? So it's going through and creating these, and if I hit refresh, it's going to go, it's still creating them through that back-end workflow. One other nuance I'll point out here, negative numbers from Plaid are inflows into the account. So this negative 500 is a refund back to my account, whereas the positive numbers are expenses. These are things that I'm buying. So you may want to display those in inverse, so multiply everything by -1. Again, depends on your use case. So that is getting Plaid transactions, the historical data, into our database. How would I go ahead and display this? If I go back to my Plaid transactions page, you'll see I have just a repeating group right here. If I wanted to show what are all the transactions that are in my database for this account, I could go find that data type, do a search for Plaid transactions, where account is in my institution's accounts, for example. Remember back to this flow. So I'm looking for all the transactions that are part of the accounts that are part of my institution. I happen to have a group here that's at the institution level. So I'm looking for all the transactions that are in the accounts. And then maybe I would put in here, just as an example, maybe I'll just put the dates and amounts of the transactions, so that when I refresh here and connect more accounts, I could see it working. But hopefully you get the idea at this point. You can show data by then just querying your database once these transactions are saved. Next, we're going to take a look at getting data about transactions forward in time. So far we've just looked at transactions in the past from the moment your user connects their account. We need to do something a little bit different to get transactions going forward so that you can maintain an accurate record of the transactions for this user. So to see what I mean about that data forward in time, the transactions that'll happen after the moment your user connects their account so that you can maintain updated data, let's take a look back at our webhooks table. You'll see I've had some accounts connected to my app for a while here. You'll see a whole bunch of default update types of webhooks in here. Default update is the way Plaid says, hey, I have new transactions ready for you after the moment where your user connects their account. So let's say they connect their account on a Monday, and on Thursday they go to Starbucks and buy a coffee. That new transaction from Starbucks would come into your account with this default update. So your use case may or may not need that data. You might only be interested in historical data, in which case skip ahead in this video, but more than likely you're going to want to maintain that data over time. So we just need to process these default updates in a very similar way to the way we did the historical data. We're going to go into our backend workflows. We created a historical update trigger. This time I'm going to copy it, and I want to create a default update trigger. So I'll call this default updates. What's different here is now it's a transactions. The Plaid webhook codes now, instead of historical update, is default update. Did I spell that right? Default update, yes. So whenever a new default update webhook comes in, this workflow will run. It's going to try to do the same exact thing, create transactions on a list. All this is already filled out. The one thing we need to check, do we still want it to be going 90 days in the past? Not really. We could probably lessen that. But we probably don't need to, because Plaid webhook now's new transaction account will take care of that for us. What this will do is, let's say, back to the Starbucks example, they only had one new purchase. This number would just be 1, so it's only going to return the one most recent transaction within that 90-day window, which will be the one from that most recent date. So I'm not going to touch anything here. I'm going to leave it all exactly the same. And now this will run on the default update webhook. To see that in action, we have to do something a little bit different in the sandbox environment. This is not something you'll need to do in production, but in the sandbox environment, we have to tell Plaid when we want this default update to trigger. I've gone ahead and added just a button for testing purposes in my app. Sometimes I'll do this in an admin page in an app that I'm working on just to make sure I can test it as needed. And what this button does is runs another action here called sandbox only trigger transaction update webhook. It pulls in the access token for the institution that I'm interested in, so the account that my user linked goes and finds that access token. And when we click this link, it will go ahead and try to run. We stop the video that's autoplaying there. It'll go ahead and try to run. So let's see that in action. I'm going to go through, link a brand new account here, just to see the full life cycle. Let's make sure we see the historical webhooks coming, because remember that's always the first thing that'll fire. So there's our initial update webhook. There's our historical update webhook. So behind the scenes, remember what this is doing right now is going through and creating all the transactions from today back 90 days. That's what we've told the app to do. And if I go into my screen here, you can see, hey, there's all the transactions, still creating them in my database in nice order there. What I want to do is trigger a default update too, so we can make sure that's working. So just hit that button. Then let's go take another look at our webhooks table. We'll see, hey, there's a default update. In this case, it doesn't have any transactions because we just did the historical update. There's some different ways you can trick Plaid into actually giving you data here, or wait a couple days, new data will come in. But at least I can tell, hey, the default update is firing. I could go in and look at my logs, and I could see default update. And I see here in my logs, let's see if we can find this. I don't know why it doesn't want to search for default update. Let me try it in all caps. So you'll see here it created the default update, and it started, this is what this is telling us, is it started that workflow. So even though it's not finding any new transactions, I know it's working because it's running the trigger and running the correct workflow. So if we came back in a couple days, you'd see probably in your database here a few more default updates similar to what I have going on down here. Some of them would have transactions, and you'd see those new transactions set up in your database over time. So that's the basics of how you go through and save transactional data to your database using a combination of historical updates and default updates. That may not be the right answer for your use case, as we talked about at the very beginning. Rather than save transactions to your database, you may actually want to just query them in real time. Let's take a look at how to do that. So rather than saving this in the database, we're going to go on to one of our pages. I'm just using my sample page in the sample app. And what you'll see here, earlier we set up a query in this repeating group to go into my database. I want to see the very same data, but instead of going into my database, I actually want to ask Plaid for it every time this page loads. So how would I do that? I've set up a repeating group. This is going to be, I'll call this live transactions. This is going to be the transactions directly from Plaid without going through all that process of having it processed in my database, which can take a little while. So very similar to how we did in the backend workflow when we said set up that external API, we're going to do the very same thing here right on my page. So instead of this being Plaid transactions from my database, I want this to be transaction get transactions body transactions from the API. So the type of content here, get transactions, body transactions, and my data source is going to be an external API, specifically the Plaid transactions, get transactions API. Oops. And then you'll notice this looks really familiar, these different fields. It's saying, what do we want, what transactions do we want to return here? So I need to go get the access token. In this case, my parent group happens to be the institution that my user's saving. So I have that access token. Your use case may vary, but you need the access token here. I need to do the dates. Let me do the same thing we did earlier. Current date and time plus days minus 90. Make sure to format that as YYYY Same thing with the end date. I want it to be up until today. So this is going to be a rolling 90-day history. Where is current date and time? There it is. Count. If I leave this blank, I'll get the first 100. I could also hard code in here, let's say 500, if I want the first 500. This gets more complicated if you need to go above 500 because you have to use offsets. Again, we'll get into that at the end. I'm just going to hard code 500 here and give me the first 500 transactions in that 90 days. It won't always be 500 if I don't have 500 in that 90 days. So all these parameters work together. And then I just need to say transactions get transactions body transactions to map the type of content from up here. Then I can add a couple text elements to my repeating group here. So let's say I want current sales transactions date, and I want the amount. Just two simple things for now. So the difference here, it looks very similar, but this first table queries the database, this second table queries Plaid directly. go back and look at the slide from the beginning about some of the different considerations of the different ways you might want to do this. Play with it a little bit. You'll see which is right for your app. Reach out. I'm happy to talk through it. info@lostsheep.dev. So I'm available. But let's see this in action. I'm going to go back to my Plaid link. The way I happen to have this set up, every time this page loads, you have to start a new link account. That won't be the case in your app. Probably you'll load your institution data in a different way. But I'm going to go through and have it do a new link account again. And you'll see some of the differences in doing this live versus not. So this is a little bit of a faster and simpler way to get to the data. It's not necessarily as robust for things like transactional analysis, but hey, look, you see all the transactions for the last 90 days appeared almost immediately, while in the one that's saving from the database up here, they're still loading slowly. So that's what I mean by speed, is I get instant access to all the transactions from that API versus having to wait until the data loads. So again, your mileage may vary. You may very well want to do both in your app, depending on the user experience that you're looking for. But hopefully this gets you started with the different ways. So that is the basics of how you set up transactions in your application. There are, as you can probably tell, a whole lot of nuances and a whole lot of different ways to go about this. I want to talk for a minute about some of the particular nuances around transactions that I've run into, just to help unconfuse you a little bit. But again, feel free to reach out anytime, info@lostsheep.dev. So let's talk about a couple of these nuances. All right, a few nuances. I mentioned a couple of them down here in bullet number 4 on the outline for today's unit. Let's first talk about pending transactions. So what's a pending transaction? You've probably seen this in your own credit card statements. Pending transactions are things that have happened but have not yet posted, is the term, to your account. They're not yet cleared or finalized. That could be things like, if I go to a restaurant, you might see the transaction for the amount without the tip. And then when it's finalized, that amount will include the tip. So that's why there's some of that delay in there. But it means you've got to be a little careful, especially if you're saving transactions into your database. One way to handle this, again, depending on your use case, a lot of use cases I run into only care about not pending transactions. So I can just add a filter on any of the places where I'm querying data from that external API. I just can go in and say, filtered, pending equals no. It's a true and false. So what this will do is it won't include any pending transactions. The way Plaid works, pending transactions never go away. They don't turn into finalized transactions. They're just replaced by finalized transactions. That finalized transaction is a new transaction. So your default updates will get new transactions. Once they're finalized, they'll show up in your queries here. There is a whole lot more information about this in Plaid's documentation. If you're looking at it, products/pound transactions, I'll link to this on the page. And then also in Plaid products, there's a great page that talks about this called transaction states that goes through pending and posted transactions. There's in fact a whole nother way you can handle this if you really need to track the difference between pending and final transactions. There's another webhook you can implement called transactions removed and track different things around. I'll leave that exercise to you, but just wanted you to be aware that this pending transactions is a thing. It can cause transactions to disappear or to be replaced or duplicated. So something to be careful of. I, again, very rarely deal with pending transactions in use cases I see from folks. So the filtered pending equals no tends to work out pretty well for me. So that's nuance number 1. Nuance number 2, let's talk a little bit about transaction categories. The first caveat I'll give you about transaction categories is now, as of August 2021, Plaid is in process of shifting the way they do transaction categorization. Everything I tell you will probably remain true. It'll be a deprecated feature, so it'll still be out there. You can do it this way. I don't know entirely what they're doing new, but from what I've heard, it sounds interesting and exciting. So that's the caveat. What are transaction categories? Let's go look at my database that we just set up, and let's look at a couple of these transactions that came in. Transaction categories is exactly what it sounds like, the different categories of transactions. The way Plaid thinks about this is as a hierarchy. So remember I said it as a list earlier when we were setting up this field. It's a list of texts. That's exactly what this is a list of texts. So if I go in here and look at it in detail, you'll see it's food and drink, restaurants, coffee shop. There's multiple hierarchies, 3 of them actually, to the way Plaid deals with transactions. Everything will have a first category, so just payment or just travel, transfer, food and drink. Then when additional data is available, it might have a second category or even a third category within restaurants, knowing the coffee shops. Each of those IDs, so each combination is unique. So notice how food and drink restaurants is 13005000, food and drink restaurants coffee shop 13005043. So you can use category ID to get individual unique transactions or categories. There's 604 of them. I think that's right. But just beware, this is a list. Often I'll see use cases that use either only the top level category or the first 2 categories. Again, your use case may vary. If you're interested in this in a little more detail, again, I'd point you to the Plaid documentation, where if you search in here for categories, whoops. You can get all the categories. Oops, that did not take me where. Actually, it did. Down at the bottom of the page here. Where it'll show you all the different categories, and you can get this whole list from Plaid if you ever need it. So that's the heads up and the caveat about how to work with categories. The last topic from a nuance perspective that I want to talk about is handling pagination. This is one of the most complex things, working with Bubble and Plaid transactions product in particular, that can be kind of a pain, honestly. The way Plaid's transactions work, let's go take a look at it here. Remember there was this offset number and the count number? The way Plaid transactions work is it will, for performance reasons, only ever give you 500 transactions maximum back from the API for any given date range. But what it will do is it'll say, if I look at the results here, so within the results of this API, there's a field called, sorry, it's not within get transactions, it's within get transactions. There's a field in here called bodies total transactions. That'll say the total number of transactions it finds, even though it's only returning 500. So let's say your user's account has 750 transactions in the last 90 days. It would have total transactions equal 750. But this would still only return 500, and if I asked for more than 500, I'd get an error. The way to handle that is through offsets. So I would need to do this action twice. I'd need to say, give me the first 500, and then give me the next 250 starting with 501. As you can imagine, this gets a little complicated to figure out how to implement in Bubble in an automated way. There's a number of different ways you can handle it. You could do it by building this in the back-end workflows and doing this with a, say, a mod 500. If that doesn't make sense to you, you probably don't want to do it. But a mod 500 and iterate through a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You could probably ignore this use case. I don't think I have ever seen a time frame of 90 days having more than 500 transactions. I've seen longer time periods have more than 500 transactions. So there's some different ways you could handle this through dates as appropriate for your use case. You could do things like merging lists. So I can, one thing I've done is, actually, let me show you this a different way. One thing I've done is set up a conditional when this recruiting group's list of when copy this. When this total transactions is greater than 500, gone through and done and changed my data source and said merged with, oops, and I've done it again so that I can go through all these, and instead here I would start with another 500 but start at 501 only when it's more than 500. So a number of different ways you can handle it, but something to beware of if you're dealing with accounts with a whole lot of transactions is pagination. If you run into problems with that, again, feel free to reach out, info@lostcheap.dev, and I'm happy to give you a hand. So what have we seen in the last little while? We have gone through and saved those historical transactions to your Bubble database at the time your user connects an account. So that's that initial update and the historical update action that we took, and then the API we set up to go through the list of transactions and save them to my database. We learned how to maintain an updated list of transactions over time. That's that default update trigger for the next Thursday when your customer goes and buys a Starbucks drink. How does my app learn about it? It's listening for those default update webhooks and saving those transactions to your database. We saw how to go through, without dealing with all the database and the backend workflows, how to set up a transaction list for your user just directly in your app. That's good for use cases that need to be a little more performant to see the transactions instantly, or that don't want to handle all that backend logic, or that you may not need heavy analysis. All you need is some quick analytics or quick display to your user of what their transactions are. Then we talked a little bit about different nuances of transactional data, like pending transactions and transaction categories. So I hope you can see how powerful transactions can be for your app and your use case. Feel free to reach out, info@lostcheap.dev, if you have questions, comments, concerns, run into any problems. I'm available and interested in your feedback and your questions. Thank you again for watching this video on Plaid transactions and how to integrate it into your Bubble.io app. Have a good day.